Ready? Here we go.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers, listeners, readers, and most especially patrons. It's me again, Douglas Lain, and this is the first video in our new React video series. It will be a response to the YouTube channel Second Thought. My youngest son, Noah, brought this channel to my attention as a part of what I think of as his Oedipal desire to devalue his father. Second Thought is a channel run by JT Chapman, a pleasant 20-something, and the channel has 1.5 million subscribers and is an example of how left ideas can be majorly popular online. The juxtaposition between Second Thought and Sublation is dispiriting, of course. However, ever the opportunist, I took a look in order to find out just what he's doing, what JT Chapman is doing. I discovered his videos are very polished. They're interesting, and they're not even entirely wrong. In fact, when I watched his video essay, Censorship and the Future of the Internet, I realized I'd found a socialist ally, a comrade, a friend. So this video, while critical, is being offered as a comradely critique of that video. Along with the video, you're not immune to propaganda. To begin with, let's look at on censorship and the future of the internet.
So, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the state of the internet and the suppression of information. You may be thinking that this whole video will be a misguided tantrum about free speech.
Perhaps I'm misinterpreting him, but it sounds like Chapman believes that championing the principle of free speech is somehow suspect. If he does believe this, I can understand why. For nearly a decade, it has been the political right that has been most vocal about free speech and censorship, while what calls itself the left has endorsed censorship. Examples abound. There have been online campaigns of cancellation, books have been pulled from circulation, and paintings have been removed from walls of museums. But in reality, the abandonment of free speech as a primary concern turns against both the left broadly and against Marx or Marxism in particular. Marxism is an attempt to realize the promise of 19th century bourgeois revolutions, the overturning of superstition, the championing of science and reason, confidence in both individuals and the mass of men, and self-government. All of it starts with the insistence that everyone has the right to speak and think freely. I want to quote from a chapter in Chomsky and Herman's book, Manufacturing Consent, to underline the point and put it in a political context. Press is protected by the First Amendment in the United States, not for its own sake, but to enable a free political system to operate. In the end, the concern is not for the reporter or the editor, but for the citizen critic of the government. Chomsky and Herman go beyond this. They claim that free expression is a good in itself, beyond any political utility for the masses. I would agree with that. Now let's take a look at what else JT says.
There are certain groups and outlets that routinely make a fuss about supposed censorship of their content. PragerU is perhaps the most obvious example. They claim that platforms like Facebook and YouTube are suppressing their right to free speech by hiding their content. First of all, this is not the case. The whole conservative ideas are censored shtick is just a bit of theater, as evidenced by the data on which content is shared and distributed most heavily on social media. Spoiler alert, it's stuff like PragerU.
JT argues that conservative voices online have never been censored because studies have shown that conservative voices are actually more likely to be amplified by various algorithms than liberal or left voices. Now, while it's true that conservatives are more often amplified than liberals, this doesn't mean that conservatives are not frequent targets of the censors. A study from Twitter in December of 2021 did indicate that mainstream conservative politicians were more consistently amplified than mainstream liberal politicians. It also found that far-right and far-left political figures and parties were generally less likely to be amplified than mainstream or centrist parties. But this study did not address the question of which parties or political orientations were more likely to have their content flagged, shadow banned, or directly censored. And it certainly did not demonstrate that otherwise legally protected speech from conservatives is never taken down, flagged, or shadow banned. Now, when PragerU tried to sue Google for violating the company's First Amendment right, PragerU lost for the reason JT gives. Google is a private company and has its own First Amendment rights. As a publisher of content, the company is free to curate that content in whatever way it sees fit. PragerU claimed that the monopoly power of Google, the ubiquity and power that the company has over all speech in the United States and around the world, made the company obligated to abide by the First Amendment. But a court disagreed, and perhaps fairly so, given the information that was known at the time. However, information has since emerged that changes this picture.
But it wasn't until a week after the first report, after Michael Schellenberger, Barry Weiss, and other researchers joined the search of the files, that we started to grasp the significance of this story. The original promise of the internet was that it might democratize the exchange of information globally. A free internet would overwhelm all attempts to control information flow, its very existence a threat to anti-democratic forms of government everywhere. What we found in the files was a sweeping effort to reverse that promise and use machine learning and other tools to turn the internet into an instrument of censorship and social control.
Reporting from Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, Barry Weiss, Li Fong, and others in late 2022 and through to today makes it clear that the United States government's efforts to combat what they call disinformation, efforts made by the Department of Homeland Security, the CIA, the FBI, the State Department, and the CDC, amongst other agencies, included directly working with both social media companies and the mainstream press to set the terms of service that would inform the curation of content online and include the oversight of the enforcement of these terms of service. JT couldn't have known this at the time, but he probably should have strongly suspected it. After all, he'd been visited by the Department of Homeland Security himself. Returning to Twitter's internal study regarding the amplification of political perspectives, what is most important to notice is how this study concluded. It said, political amplification is only one concern with online recommendations. A similar methodology may provide insights into domains such as misinformation, manipulation, hate speech, and abusive content. Now, when you put this study into the current context, that is, when you consider the intensifying efforts of governments around the world, including the United States, to suppress what's called disinformation, the conclusion of the study should be read as a promise to do further research that will contribute to future efforts to censor the public and violate the First Amendment. In the other JT Chapman video essay I want to talk about, You're Not Immune to Propaganda, he sketches out the story of how the Iraq War in 2003 was justified by a state-run propaganda campaign. However, what he doesn't mention, probably because he was just a kid at the time, was that while the New York Times and other news organizations did help spread the government's narrative about the war, they also published what the Department of Homeland Security might label malinformation today. That is, they published true stories that didn't fit the government narrative. For example, in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, the journalist Seymour Hersh published many articles that warned that the war was being launched on false premises. Even more importantly, Hersh broke the story about torture in Abu Ghraib in 2004. The story generated international outrage and led the Bush administration to have to make excuses and distance itself from the illegal practices. But it soon became evident that the Bush administration's policies that narrowly defined torture and that authorized the use of what they called enhanced interrogation techniques were largely responsible for the specific incidents of torture that had been captured in photographs and made known to the world. In 2022, Hersh's story that the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline was a result of a U.S. military operation wasn't published in The New Yorker, but was self-published on Substack. When people tried to post the link to the article on Facebook, their effort is suppressed by the algorithm. Rather than allowing a user to link to Hersh's story, Facebook flashes the following message. Before you share this content, you might want to know there's additional reporting from FactTisc. Pages and websites that repeat publish or share false news will see their overall distribution reduced and be restricted in other ways. Learn more. FactTisc is a fact-checking website in Norway. It is partially owned by the Norwegian state and funded by the NRK, the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, a state-owned media outlet. Returning to JT Chapman's video essay, You're Not Immune to Propaganda, Chapman spells out how the neoliberal era was defined by a state effort to prop up the supposedly free market. However, what he leaves out is how these efforts to prop up the free market were operating during a time of mostly unchecked American power. He wrote that the logic of the market was pushed into every aspect of our lives. Quote, the market came first, and everything else followed. However, in the case of social media, this effort to prop up the free marketplace of ideas online created a situation wherein their business models could not only function, but dominate. Chapman argues that under neoliberalism, the state functioned to meet the needs of business. They tied welfare and healthcare to work, for example, in order to make sure that there was an ample amount of willing workers for the capitalists to exploit. They criminalized homelessness, he says, in the service of market logic. Businesses can't operate if their doorways are blocked by homeless people sleeping in the streets. They increased state and corporate surveillance in order to more easily exploit people and increase consumption through more effective and targeted advertising. For the sake of brevity, I'll limit my critique to what he says about surveillance. But if you want a more thorough critique of JT's understanding of neoliberalism, I'll link to a longer version of this essay in the description on YouTube. JT said that under neoliberalism, the increase in surveillance serves to drive people to consume. Targeted ads based on the private data of individuals create profits for social media and the companies that deploy the ads. But is that still the case? The Marketing Insider Group doesn't believe so. Under the headline, Digital Ads Don't Work, and Everyone Knows It, Michael Brenner argued that 36% of the clicks on paid ads are fraudulent, that the conversion rate hovers around 0%, and that when the money disappears from this sector, companies spend about $400 billion annually on digital ads. This will pop yet another bubble in our economy. Overall, the digital sector is based on the presence of low interest rates and an entrepreneurial scramble to create a platform that will gain enough fictitious capital to be well positioned to endure inevitable crashes when bubbles pop. Take Amazon. The company only became profitable, only survived the dot-com bubble of 2000, because Bill Clinton had made it easier for companies to create convertible debt in 1993. Neoliberal deregulation of the banks allowed Amazon to attract enough cash to endure when so many other dot-com experiments were imploding. Specifically, it was due to the huge amount of speculation before the bubble burst. Speculation that allowed America Online to grab $1.5 billion in debt and purchase Time Warner, that Amazon was able to acquire $600 million in loans before the rest of the dot-coms imploded. The same financial wizard, Warren Jensen, orchestrated both the AOL and Amazon deals. Today, Amazon is profitable because of its product called AWS, or Amazon Web Services. Without this part of the business, Amazon would have operated at a loss last year. And while Amazon won't tell us how it makes money specifically, it is known that without the billions of dollars the company received in state contracts, the company would have operated at a loss in 2022. Beyond the direct contracts that prop up big tech, these companies rely on the state to create the conditions, both legally and fiscally, they require to continue operating. Low interest rates, massive infusions of qualitative easing, and a legal framework that protects them from lawsuits are the keys to big tech's success. No, the aim of surveillance is not to push the masses to consume or buy products. In a capitalist society based on wage labor, personal consumption is the only way working class people survive. Workers don't have to be propagandized into shopping. Further, according to Karl Marx, the way that capitalism, and not just neoliberalism, expands the realm of consumption is something to be celebrated and not railed against. In the Grundrisse, Marx wrote, "Each capitalist does demand that his workers should save, but only his own, because they stand towards him as workers, but by no means the remaining world of workers, for these stand towards him as consumers. In spite of all pious speeches, he therefore searches for means to spur them on to consumption, to give his wares new charms, to inspire them with new needs by constant chatter. It is precisely this side of the relation of capital and labor, which is an essential civilizing moment, and on which the historic justification, but also the contemporary power of capital rests." The purpose of surveillance of the public is to create a system of social control. The surveillance allows the state to track its enemies, which includes everyone who might become dissatisfied and turn against the establishment and its power. To close out, I want to quote the French radical Guy Debord, who, way back in 1988, wrote about the concept of disinformation in a pamphlet entitled Comments on the Society of the Spectacle. Debord wrote, "The confusionist concept of disinformation is pushed into the limelight instantaneously to refute, by the very noise of its name, all critique that has not been sufficiently made to disappear by the diverse agencies of the organization of silence. For example, could one day be said, should this appear desirable, that this text is a disinformation campaign against a spectacle, or indeed, since it is the same thing, a piece of disinformation harmful to democracy." I'll say that again, paraphrase it in a way that is a bit less French. The concept of disinformation itself is designed to confuse the public. It aims to trick the public into abandoning their own power by convincing them that somewhere there are people in authority who know the truth and are capable of managing life for them. When people in power start to talk about disinformation, they do so in order to silence all criticism of their own failures and crimes. When the ordinary manufacture of consent, the usual corporate mechanisms of propaganda fail, the state will trot out this word, disinformation. Anything critical of the way things are, anything that claims that this society is not the best possible society, that insists upon judging the world, critiquing it, might one day be called disinformation. Perhaps even I will one day be accused of being a Russian agent or an enemy of democracy.
Hey, Turner. How do you know they'll print it?
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.